we're going to talk about Bylaw 14, which is academic eligibility for student athletes. We really want to focus on 3 areas today within Bylaw 14. And these areas are really areas that we get a lot of questions about, so that's why we thought we would highlight these particular areas for you. The first is enrollment requirements. What are the basic enrollment requirements for a student athlete to be eligible to practice and compete? And in particular, we want to spend more time talking about some exceptions to those requirements. So when can your student athlete continue to participate while not enrolled as a full-time student? We're going to explore that for a little bit. The second is seasons of participation. When does a student athlete use one of those 4 seasons of participation? And what are some examples of when a season participation is not used or some exceptions to that specific rule? And then Caitlin will take you through Bylaw 1419, which is participation of student athletes who are pursuing a graduate degree or a second undergraduate degree at your institution. What are the unique participation requirements for those student athletes? And if they don't meet those requirements, is there waiver relief, and what are the things you must consider when submitting that type of request via legislative relief waiver? So enrollment requirements, the basic rule, you have to be enrolled as a full-time student in order at the certifying institution. In order to practice, that student athlete has to be enrolled as a full-time student as defined by your institution for any other student that is in that particular degree program. That requirement's a little bit different for competition. For competition, a student athlete must be enrolled in at least 12 semester or quarter hours in order to be eligible to compete. For a graduate student, that student must be enrolled as a full-time graduate student as defined by your institution for any other graduate student at specific degree program. Again, for a graduate, that definition is true for both practice and competition. So let's talk about some exceptions. So we know the student athlete has to be full-time in order to practice and compete. However, there are certain exceptions to that rule. This is one that actually results in a lot of questions for us. So a student has completed their degree and wants to continue to participate through the end of the season. When can they do that and not be enrolled or enrolled less than full time? So they can do that if there's a postseason event that begins within 60 days after the end of the term in which the student athlete graduates or completes their degree requirements. Or the student athlete has completed their degree requirements in fewer than 4 consecutive years from their initial date of enrollment, and they've already been charged with a season of participation. In both of those cases, the student athletes can continue to participate without being enrolled. The last requirement is Bylaw 1419, and this is one Caitlin will go over. So a student athlete who's in fact graduated and is going to return to your institution or is coming to your institution as a graduate student or seeking a second degree would have to be enrolled full-time, as we described earlier. One of the questions we really get a lot in this specific space is, does my student athlete have to meet all 3 of these? Do they have to meet 2 of these? It's important to remember that a student athlete to use this exception only has to meet one of the 3 conditions outlined here. They don't have to meet all 3, but only one of those. So here's a question we received, an interpretive question we received from the membership. So we have a basketball student athlete who's graduated in December, and they've attended school for 3.5 years. So they've been in school for 3.5 continuous years from their date of initial full-time enrollment. So can that student athlete finish their season without having to enroll in the spring term? As we look at the legislation that kind of guides this exception, we would look at the second prong. If the student athlete completed their degree requirements in fewer than 4 consecutive years, and they've already been charged with a season of participation. Obviously, C is not the case. The student athlete doesn't want to come back, and A wouldn't work because the championship doesn't begin within 60 days. So we really got to see, does the student athlete meet this second condition? So in this case, because the student athlete has graduated in fewer than 4 years, remember the student athlete graduated in 3.5 academic years. And because they're a basketball student athlete, they've already been charged with a season of participation for the fall term. This student athlete can continue to compete in the spring term through the conclusion of the season without having to enroll in any classes in the spring term. And it's based upon that highlighted portion of that particular exception. Let's look at this next interpretive request we received. We have a swimming student athlete who graduated in December. They've attended school for 4 years and would like to continue to compete in the conference championship meet, which is in February. But this student athlete doesn't want to enroll in any classes in the spring term. So the question we were asked is, can the student athlete finish their season without having to enroll in the spring term? And again, here we go back to that legislative exception, trying to figure out which of the 3 prongs do we need to explore. Because the student athlete hasn't graduated in fewer than 4 academic years, we're really not looking at the second prong. Student athlete, we've been told by the institution, doesn't want to come back and enroll in another degree program or a graduate program. So we're not looking at the third prong. Really what we're looking at is A, does the postseason event, which in the NCAA championship is an example, begin within 60 days after the end of the term? So the question we have to ask is, when does the 60-day period really begin? So the student athlete can participate in the spring if a postseason event falls within 60 days when the student athlete completed their degree. So the 60-day period begins the day after they've graduated or completed their degree requirements. In this case, it would be the end of the fall term. We're not looking at the conference championship to determine whether the student athlete can continue to participate. What we're looking at is, does another event that falls outside the declared playing season, in this case the NCAA championship, begin within 60 days? If the NCAA championship begins within 60 days from the end of the fall term in which the student athlete completed their degree requirements, that student athlete can continue to participate without having to enroll in the spring term. If only the conference championship begins within that 60-day period, the student athlete would not be eligible to use the exception. So the student athlete would either have to stop participation immediately at the conclusion of the fall term, or the student athlete would have to enroll as a graduate student. So let's move on to another exception. This is a very common exception also for full-time enrollment. It's called the final term exception. So this is an exception for a student athlete who is in their final term of their undergraduate degree program. And this student athlete only needs less than a full-time course load to be eligible to complete their degree requirements. In that instance, the student athlete is eligible to continue to participate while enrolled in only those classes they need to be able to complete their degree requirements. A couple things to keep in mind: it has to be the final term of their degree program. They have to be in the classes necessary to complete their degree. So at the end of the term, they would be eligible to graduate. They don't have to graduate, but they have to have completed all the academic requirements for that specific degree program. If they fail to do that, that student athlete forfeits eligibility for all the remaining eligibility in all sports moving forward. It is not a violation. The student athlete just really forfeits their eligibility going forward. Management Council, at their February meeting, approved in concept a non-controversial proposal that expands this particular exception to go beyond classes just needed for the student athlete's degree program. It expands it to include courses the student athlete needs to complete in order to fulfill an optional minor or undergraduate certificate program. So the student athlete has completed all their degree requirements, but say they need 6 hours to complete their minor. Student athlete, prior to this non-controversial proposal, would have to enroll full-time in order to go back and complete their minor. This exception, beginning in this fall, would allow that student athlete now to come back, just take the classes they need to be able to complete their minor and continue to participate. It's really important for you to be aware that this proposal was not adopted in response to COVID-19. This proposal was being considered actually in September by the Interpretations Legislative Committee. It really is dealing with a question that we get almost every fall about student athletes who want to complete a minor, have eligibility, but have already completed their degree. Can they come back just to take the 6 hours they need to complete the minor? And we'll talk about our response here in a second, but a few things I want to talk about in terms of the minor. This exception cannot be used after the student athlete graduates. This is really for the student athlete to be able to complete the minor prior to their graduation. Once the student athlete graduates, their enrollment eligibility would be based on 1419. They would have to be a full-time student. This also expands the final term exception. So if a student athlete's already used that exception to complete the courses they need to complete their specific degree, they cannot then use the exception a second time to complete their minor. The student athlete in that case would have to go to school full-time to complete their minor or undergraduate certificate program. If the student athlete uses this exception to complete their minor or undergraduate certificate program and the student athlete fails to complete that coursework, the student athlete forfeits all remaining eligibility in all sports. So this is an actual question that we receive. Fairly common question, as I said, that we receive every fall. So you have a student athlete who's completed their coursework. They're in their final term. They need 9 hours to complete their minor. The minor is not a required component of their degree, which means that student athlete could otherwise graduate without completing their minor. So it's really what we consider to be an optional minor. You can see under prior response, before this non-controversial proposal, we would tell that student athlete that they would have to return as a full-time student because they've already completed their degree requirements. The response will be able to provide institutions moving forward that student athlete could use that final term exception to complete the minor requirements without having to be full-time, provided they did not use that exception previously to complete their degree program. So it allows that student athlete to fulfill their academic requirements for the minor without having to enroll in a full course load. So seasons of participation. You can see the base rule we have is a student athlete uses a season of participation. They practice to compete after the first contest in the traditional segment. There are 3 exceptions to that. So a student athlete won't use one if they participate in a preseason scrimmage before the first contest, or during the non-traditional segment, the student athlete participates in an alumni contest conducted before the first regular season contest. Or in the sports of baseball, field hockey, lacrosse, soccer, softball, and volleyball, the student athlete participates in a non-traditional segment. So again, a student athlete has 4 seasons of participation. That season of participation is used if the student athlete either competes or practices after the first contest in the traditional segment with those noted exceptions. So let's turn to a question we received about seasons of participation. The institution has a student manager in the sport of volleyball. The student athlete now wants to join the team in the non-traditional segment. So they were managers during the traditional segment, conducted those activities are normally associated with a manager, didn't participate with the team. Now non-traditional segments occurring, and they want to begin to practice and compete with the team in the non-traditional segment. They also want to know if this individual goes with the team on a foreign tour and practices with the team in preparation for that foreign tour. Would that trigger a season of participation? So it's really 3 questions. Can the student athlete practice and compete during the non-traditional season and not use a season of participation? Can they practice the team in preparation for the foreign tour without using a season of participation? And can they practice and compete with the team during the foreign tour without using a season of participation? Then you can see our response. The team manager would be able to participate with the team during a non-traditional segment. Once again, one of those exceptions that say in certain sports, if you compete and participate in a non-traditional segment, you do not use a season of participation. Volleyball is one of those particular sports. The second 2 questions is, can the student athlete then practice in preparation for the foreign tour and actually compete in the foreign tour? Well, Bylaw 14247 provides an exception. That's if the student athlete who didn't participate during the season that they just completed, the traditional season, and who represents the institution in a foreign tour prior to the start of the next academic year is not charged with a season of participation. So for this particular case, because this foreign tour is occurring after traditional segment, this particular student athlete would not use a season of participation.
Thanks, Bill. All right, so we're going to get started with post-baccalaureate student participation. So once a student athlete graduates with their undergraduate degree, the only way they can be eligible at a Division III institution is if they meet the requirements of Bylaw 1419. The student athlete first must have graduated from a Division III institution, and this means that only student athletes who graduate from your Division III institution or another Division III institution can be eligible as graduate or post-baccalaureate students. Second, they must be enrolled and seeking a graduate or second baccalaureate degree at your institution. This means that the student athlete cannot just be enrolled in courses for a graduate certificate program or a minor. Third, the student athlete must have eligibility remaining, and this goes to the seasons of participation. They must have at least one season of participation remaining in their sport. And lastly, they must still have semesters remaining within their 10th semester or 15-quarter eligibility period. The bigger question is who does not meet this legislation? And that would include graduates from Division I, Division II, NAIA, and foreign institutions. Those student athletes are not considered transfer students, and they do not have access to transfer exceptions. So the only way they can become eligible is through a legislative relief waiver. And that's really what we're going to focus our discussion on today, is the waiver process. Many graduates from non-Division III institutions pursue this waiver option once they've been accepted into a graduate program at a Division III institution. The Division III Subcommittee for Legislative Relief established a directive for waivers of Bylaw 1419 that, when satisfied, will result in waiver relief the waiver being approved. President's Council was the ultimate authority over this directive. You can find it on ncaa.org on the D3 compliance page underneath legislative relief waivers. The link is also included on this slide that's in your LMS presentation and will also be shared after these webinars. So this directive provides graduate student eligibility for student athletes who have demonstrated compelling and exemplary academic success at their previous institution and has provided relief of Bylaw 1419 since 2008. The criteria for the directive was changed last year by President's Council, and those changes are reflected on the slide. It's important to note where we were and where we are today with this directive because the subcommittee has advised staff to temporarily consider student athletes' relief under both the former directive criteria and the new directive. The current directive has 4 criteria. First, the student athlete must have graduated within 4 years. The student athlete, secondly, must have seasons of participation remaining per Division III legislation. So let's pause on that one real quick. Like Bill discussed earlier, what do we know that's unique to Division III for use of season? Practice after the first contest in the traditional segment will result in the use of a season. So we're considering not only competition, but practice when we look to this prong. So this will require a little bit more due diligence on the part of the compliance administrator to ensure the transfer tracer is accurate from the previous institution. So if you're looking for a grad student, the previous institution may only mark the use of the season based on their institution's rules. So for example, if a graduate coming from a D1 or D2 school, they only use a season when they compete. It may require a follow-up phone call to make sure that the student athlete didn't have a redshirt year and didn't practice that entire year, and they weren't considering that participation. So the third requirement is that the student athlete must have maintained continuous full-time enrollment during their undergraduate experience. And lastly, the student athlete must have achieved at least a minimum of a 3.0 cumulative GPA. You will note on the slide that the first prong crosses out the requirement that the student athlete graduate ahead of schedule. So that was a requirement of the old directive. Instead, it's replaced by the student athlete graduating within 4 academic years. So this change was a product of the subcommittee's recognition that there are many challenging academic programs that don't allow for early graduation, and as such, early graduation isn't necessarily indicative of compelling and exemplary academic success. Also, you'll see in the second criterion regarding the student athlete having seasons remaining is bolded and underlined. This is intended to show that this is a new requirement that was not part of the old three-pronged directive. This change speaks to the intent that underlines the Division III's higher standards for graduate student participation. The intent of the directive was to limit grad student participation to academically excellent students so that there wasn't this undesirable recruiting focus on Division I and II redshirts who could feasibly take advantage of 5 seasons of participation per Division III rules by, for example, practicing their first year or redshirting their first year and then continuing to compete for their remaining 8 semesters or 4 years. So this requirement is intended to eliminate that concern. So let's jump to the next slide. To summarize, staff in the subcommittee will temporarily be reviewing the eligibility of graduate or post-baccalaureate students under both the new directive and the criteria for the former directive when you apply for a waiver. The table on the slide should help serve as a checklist for you when your coach comes to you about recruiting a Division I, II, NAIA, or foreign institution graduate. Generally, the student athlete will need to either satisfy all criteria in either the left or the right column. It's really important to note that the subcommittee does not consider a hybrid of both the current and former directive standards. The student athlete would need to meet one or the other. So with that, we're going to dive into some case studies to put this directive to the test. The student athlete graduated from a Division I institution with a 3.2 cumulative GPA. Student athlete took advanced placement courses in high school. With those extra credits, the student athlete was able to graduate after 7 consecutive semesters, or in other words, in 3.5 years, and was enrolled full-time each of those semesters. The student athlete has practiced and competed in a total of 3 seasons of volleyball. So remember, this table is your checklist for the directive, and we're going to be moving away from the old directive. So let's see if it fits under the current directive first. We know the student athlete graduated within 4 years, only participated in 3 seasons, was enrolled full-time consecutively, and had a 3.2 GPA. Easy enough, right? The student athlete meets all prongs of the new directive. And for good measure, this student athlete would also satisfy the old directive because the student athlete graduated early in 3.5 years. So this waiver would be approved. The next one, student athlete graduated from a Division II institution with a cumulative 2.62 GPA. The student athlete graduated upon completion of 8 semesters or within 4 years and was enrolled full-time each semester. The student athlete never participated in athletics at the student athlete's previous institution and has 4 seasons of participation remaining in football. Again, we want to try to evaluate under the current directive first because we don't know how long the subcommittee will permit for flexibility to grant waivers under the old directive. Also, we know the student athlete did not graduate early, so they would not meet the old directive criteria anyway. We can check off the first and third prongs because the student athlete graduated in 8 semesters with no breaks in full-time enrollment. We can also check off the second prong because we know the student athlete has not used any seasons of participation in their sport per Division III rules. However, we do know the student athlete did not have at least a 3.0 GPA. So what does this mean for the student athlete? Student athlete does not meet the current directive or the criteria for the old directive. Does that mean this waiver will automatically be denied? No. So even though the student athlete does not satisfy the directive, staff may approve under a student athlete well-being or a totality of circumstances rationale to consider other extenuating circumstances. In fact, the subcommittee has guidelines instructing staff to consider such extraordinary and extenuating circumstances, but the real question is what's considered compelling enough to warrant relief when you don't meet the directive. Here, the only other mitigation put forward is that the student athlete has never participated in intercollegiate athletics. So the argument made by the institution was there's no competitive advantage gained. Should that alone result in relief? The subcommittee has taken a firm position, and it's published in the subcommittee's guidelines, that no, non-participation alone in intercollegiate athletics should not warrant relief of Bylaw 1419. So with that direction, this waiver was denied. Next case study. The student athlete graduated from a Division I institution upon completion of 8 semesters within 4 years and possessing a 3.1 cumulative GPA. The student athlete was full-time each semester and competed in 3 seasons of basketball. The student athlete also redshirted during the student athlete's first year because of a persistent back injury. However, the student athlete practiced the entire season. Okay, so back to our checklist. Under the current directive, would the student athlete satisfy all prongs? Student athlete graduated in 8 semesters, so within 4 years, but the student athlete used 4 seasons of participation per Division III rules. Specifically, practice after the first contest in the traditional segment is considered use of a season, so the student athlete effectively used a full season of participation that first year when the student athlete redshirted or practiced. So let's check the old directive criteria, see if they meet that one. The student athlete would not satisfy the first prong because they did not graduate early. So again, we have a student athlete who does not meet either directive. So is there anything else compelling here that should warrant relief? The subcommittee did not think so. Here, the school emphasized the use of a season. In this case, the student athlete's practice used a season of participation, so the extent to which the student athlete got game time or was a highly contributing member of the team during practice would not change the competitive advantage considered to be gained here. And remember, non-participation alone or lack of participation is not considered compelling enough to warrant relief. With no other mitigation asserted, this waiver was denied. So some key takeaways, and I know that we've harped on one of them quite a bit. Temporarily, the student athlete may be granted grad student eligibility based on satisfying either the old or current directive for compelling and exemplary academic success. A hybrid of both will not be considered. And also the non-participation in intercollegiate athletics alone will not be considered sufficient mitigation to warrant relief of 1419. Some other key considerations to just kind of be tracking on is extraordinary and extenuating circumstances that are appropriately documented. So say you've got a student athlete who does not meet the directive, but they're seeking eligibility at a particular Division III institution because it's close to home and allows the student athlete to continue caregiving responsibilities for their terminally ill parent. Those are the types of extenuating and extraordinary circumstances that staff will consider when the student athlete does not meet the directive, but there's just a lot more going on there for that enrollment. Also, military service will be considered. For example, if the student athlete took a break from full-time enrollment to participate in basic training for military service, and that's the only reason they don't meet the directive, relief would be provided, and there would be flexibility to consider military service. In order for the Division III institution to file the waiver, the student athlete must have graduated and be accepted and enrolled into the graduate or post-baccalaureate program. This kind of prevents the situation where the student athlete may be shopping around schools and having institutions file legislative relief waivers on their behalf. With this demonstration that they've been accepted into a program, we don't really see many requests on behalf of one student athlete. And lastly, but also really important, the unavailability of a student athlete's degree program at the school they graduated from. So in other words, they want to enroll at your Division III institution because the desired grad program was not offered at their previous school. Like non-participation alone, this mitigation alone will not be considered sufficient relief to grant a relief of Bylaw 1419. Well, like always, if you have any questions and you thought that they may be more fact-specific and appropriate for RSRO, you can always use that as a tool. I just wanted to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. Please feel free to reach out to staff or through your compliance officer through the RSRO system if you think of a question later on regarding the content we covered today. Again, thank you for joining us and hope you have a great remainder of your week and afternoon.